I don't know what magic deal he has up his ass. Just like Trump says he has up his ass. He's going to sit down first day, pull out this peace deal, in 24 hours, all going to be over. Paul's not making that claim, but if you're saying that there was a peace deal possible, I just like to see it. Because I don't see it. And I've been looking at it desperately. I've been looking for it desperately because I don't want my friends to keep dying. I don't like getting bombed that much. We'll do this because I already told them that I'd be willing to talk to them again about this, but that was like 7 days ago and there hasn't been any movement about this. But Paul, TJ, and Scotty reviewed a Kyle Kalinske news segment talking about basically rumors that there are United States officials and other European officials that are nervous about Ukraine's odds in the war and want a peace deal. And some of those rumors are extending out to saying that certain officials are trying to pressure the Ukrainians into their peace deal. The Ukrainians have rejected this assertion, saying that these are just rumors, that no official has come to the Ukrainians and talked to them about a peace deal. And I don't know how true the story is because the Ukrainians reject it. There doesn't seem to be any Ukrainian sources saying the same thing. It could be true, but I also could believe that there, like is true with many issues in the State Department, there are people in the State Department who agree with the policy to continue to support Ukraine with aid, and others who are much more doomer-pilled, who maybe view the war less optimistically, and they want to do a deal. And their interests in, for example, trying to get displaced people back to Crimea, Donetsk, Luhansk, and all these areas, they don't have those interests. And so they're willing to, ask for those compromises from within the State Department. But it's hard for me to imagine those officials somehow getting to Ukrainians and sending that message to them without the explicit approval of the Biden administration, which is why I don't really believe that is happening. But I can believe that there are people in the State Department who don't agree. For example, there were like 100 junior and deputy State Department officials like across the State Department who rejected Biden's position on Israel-Palestine. This happened during the Trump administration too, when it came to, I think it was the Kurds in northeastern Syria and the Syria pullout. There were a bunch of people who objected using formal channels. So I can believe that is happening, but I don't know about the pressuring. I don't know if I believe that. Anyway, that's the only background I wanted to give you guys before we started.
Biden administration officials also are worried that Ukraine is running out of forces, while Russia has a seemingly endless supply.
What? The hell did you hear, TJ? I heard what was said. Open your ears.
Onion nuggets.
This is one of the videos that our patrons on our new merch tier Patreon level. But this is Kyle Kalinske talking about a potential Russia-Ukraine peace deal.
Wow. Did Donald Trump call them up?
Here is what I would call a shocking development. Now,
well, I think people should know, what's happening with this is that support for the Ukraine war has been waning in the American public for the last year or so. And they've reached a point where basically a stalemate has happened in Ukraine. It's turning into like trench warfare where, victories are measured in inches, that sort of thing. And it looks like it's going to go on and on and on.
I do want to throw a few things out there. The majority of Americans still support aid, either maintaining current levels or increasing aid. And most polling data seems to indicate that. And I will say, when it comes to foreign aid to other countries, even if it's still now it's a small majority and not a massive majority like it was initially at the start, when everybody was seeing the horrors of Russian atrocities in Bucha, and now people have moved on to other horrors as many of those horrors still continue. I think that the numbers have come down, but a majority of Americans supporting aid to any country is still pretty high as a standard comparative to other aid projects or support for aid to different countries, especially military aid. So I would still point to that and say, it's almost 2 years on and a majority of Americans still support military aid to Ukraine. after the news cycle has gone through other wars, other conflicts, other political issues, that the Ukrainians have been able to keep the eye of the American public on them enough to continue their support. And that is also with a lot of disinformation being pushed out to them, whether it be the most popular news show in cable news, Tucker Carlson going out and saying that for every Russian soldier that dies, 7 Ukrainians die. Having RFK come on a week later to say the same thing, no corrections ever issued by Fox, completely debunked nonsense. The numbers were actually flipped. It was for every Ukrainian dies, 2.5 Russian dies from the Jack Textera leaks that they were citing. They just had fake documents. There's so many different instances of disinformation. For example, the recent UN numbers that people are continuously reposting. And that's not even, I would say, disinformation. I don't know if the correct word is misinformation or disinformation. I see people reposting that not maliciously, thinking that they're posting real numbers, where the UN, the official number for like UN civilian dead in this country is, I said this country, I just left Ukraine, and Ukraine is 10,000. So people will compare that to the Gaza numbers or try to be like, wow, see how, to try to emphasize the brutality of the bombardment in Gaza, which I understand, but it ends up underestimating and underemphasizing how brutal it was in Ukraine, because the UN explicitly states that their number is like a giant undercount. And just like in Mariupol, they said like 1,000 people died in Mariupol. AP estimates have it between 35 to 75,000 dead. The number increased from the official government estimate of just 35,000 after AP did an expansive report finding giant mass graves. Remember, that's 35 to 75,000 dead just from looking at the mass graves. Could be higher. We don't have teams on the ground. We don't know. But that's compared to what? 10,000 on the official UN numbers that was being spread around? And it's all little things like that that have impacts on the discourse, on how people talk about the war in Ukraine. For example, people saying like democracy was ended by Zelensky, those types of lies being pushed. Or that Christianity was banned. I see people repeating that about Ukraine, that Christianity was banned in Ukraine. Just ridiculous nonsense. And when you don't tell people the successes of what the aid has done in helping to liberate over 50% of the territory that the Russians have captured since 2022, but to help liberate the only provincial capital that the Russians captured in the whole war, the city of Kherson, to help push back the Russians from Kharkiv, making it a much safer city to live. How the aids have helped protect Ukraine's skies, how the aid has helped save Ukrainian lives when it comes to not only through medical aid and stuff like that, but I assume we're going to get into the population issue in a moment. American provided tanks and armored personnel carriers are much safer. The Western style armored personnel carriers, Western style tanks, the Western style APVs, many APVs, armored personnel carriers. These ones are much safer for crews. They're designed with crew safety much more in mind than the 60, 70-year-old Soviet models. And when you see these failed assaults, and you saw this a lot at the start of the Zaporozhye counteroffensive, you see the hatches of the tanks and of the vehicles are open, of these Western vehicles that are being trotted around by the Russians everywhere, saying, look at the failed offensive. But I noticed that the hatches were open, and the hatches were open because the crew survived and they got out. And preserving that training, preserving those lives are so important for Ukraine surviving and winning this war. Not only because they need as many lives as possible, but preserving that training time so they can go and move to another vehicle, that is unbelievably important. But that saving of a life and that saving of a crew, while it matters in the safety of the crew, it does not matter when it comes to the effectiveness of the military if they don't have another tank to put them in. Which is why I think 31 Abrams, which if you believe anywhere close to the Ukrainian numbers being put out or close to reality, is sometimes more tanks than are being lost in a day by the Russians on their assault on Avdiivka and other positions on the front right now. I don't think that's enough. Anyway, let's get back into this.
And so with this Israeli-Palestinian genocide that's going on right now.
Talking about 2024, dude.
Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead.
With this Israeli-Palestinian genocide going on right now, lawmakers are starting to question, like, how much longer are we going to be sending, $20 billion every 2 or 3 months to Ukraine? Like the support for this has waned even in the political community now. And so now there's this question of, and see, this is why I was an advocate, right?
By the way, can I just let me throw two things out there. He said the stalemate thing earlier. When we talk about stalemates, I think some people, when they hear stalemate, they think that like they've all just hit like a line here and it's just like, and like nobody can get the upper hand over anybody anywhere, and like just kind of ramming into each other. When the front is a lot more dynamic than that. But the front line isn't just the actual territorial control changing hands. There's also a front line on the seas, which the Ukrainians have done very well on over the last year, giving Russia some of the most humiliating naval losses since like the Second World War that they've suffered. They lost a submarine, the Black naval port in Odessa, the Black Sea naval port, which supposedly, if you believe the realists, and only the realists, was part of the reason they launched this whole war in the first place, was to go into Crimea and secure that port. That one's getting fucked up. Is getting fucked up bad. When it comes to the drone production war, we're seeing that the Ukrainians are upping production into massive amounts, and it's one of the areas where they might actually have good parity with the Russians, or some sort of parity with the Russians. The front is much more dynamic than that. For example, Russia putting cluster bombs on a lot of the plane munitions that they're using right now in Avdiivka is having an impact on the battlefield. I think when people say stalemate, though, some people assume that it's just like World War I style, they're just ramming into each other over and over and over again, when the front line is a lot more dynamic than that. There is a lot more elements of the front changing. For example, the Russians have to keep pulling upon air defense systems, thinning out their national security, taking air defense systems out of eastern Russia, out of the middle parts of Russia, out of Kaliningrad, in order to reinforce their air defense systems in Crimea and in Ukraine, which I do think is a part of the front moving in a way. Because logistics, supplies, and munitions and what you have at your disposal is going to affect what territory you can control at the end of the day. If the Russia, for example, if the Ukrainians spent all of their supplies for this year just holding the front line and the territory didn't change, that's a stalemate if you just look at the territory control. It's not a stalemate if you look at the long-term conditions of the war, because they just burnt through everything, and the next year they're going to fall. And so I just want to say, when we're talking about stalemate, we're saying territorial control has not changed hands much in the last 6 to 8 months. And that is something that I would agree with.
And so now there's this question of, and see, this is why I was an advocate right from the start for this type, because now all of a sudden you start hearing peace treaty deals being thrown around, and it's like,
oh, can I say one more thing? Because they were talking about politicians getting kind of $20 billion every 2 to 3 months. I wish it was that much. I wish it was every 2 months, $20 billion. Oh my God. That would be $120 billion a year. Man, God, that'd be good. Yeah, no, we're not getting that though. We're not getting that. We're not so, Ukraine is not so blessed. But, I think when people hear these amounts of money, none of it is done with anything else relative in mind. People hear like $20 billion, $10 billion, $75 billion. They hear these big amounts. Most of the times it's not in the billions anymore. Now it's in the millions. They hear like $100 million, $200 million. Nobody is saying relative to what though. Because when you realize how big the United States federal budget is, how much money we have at our disposal, how much military gear we have at our disposal, and what percentage of Pentagon spending is being spent on this, like, people's perspective on the war does change. I've seen polling data where they ask people just basic questions of the war, then they inform them of specific pieces of information, like how much money relative to Pentagon spending, relative to the United States budget, relative to our GDP, how much has been spent relative to that, instead of just throwing out numbers that nobody knows relative to what. Like $1 billion sounds like a lot of money. It's not a lot of money if I tell you $1 billion to make a national, like a universal healthcare program, right? Relative to what? $1 billion is a lot when we're building like a small road. $1 billion is not a lot if we're rebuilding national American healthcare. And so when you give people more information, like it's for 5% of the Pentagon spending, we've achieved these things in Ukraine, pushing back the Russians from 50% of the territory they've captured since 2022. Stuff, key pieces of information like that. And Americans see 10 to 15 to 20 point jumps in support for Ukraine when giving these key pieces of information, because there's just so much noise in the information space. People don't really sit down and consider exactly what has been achieved with the aid we've already given Ukraine and what we all thought was going to happen come February 2022 and where we are now and the conversation we're having now and what we've seen Ukraine achieve since then with 2 successful large-scale counteroffensives, both in the Kharkiv Oblast and the Kherson Oblast. Anyway, continuing. I just wanted to just say that if we compare it to Afghanistan and Iraq, $8 trillion, $75 billion to achieve what we have achieved, I think we spent our money wisely.
This has waned even in the political community now. And so now there's this question of, and see, this is why I was an advocate right from the start for this type, because now all of a sudden you start hearing peace treaty deals being thrown around. And it's like, so after an entire generation of Ukrainian people have been ground into pulp,
Right.
like losses there are absolutely fucking staggering, not to even mention the Russian losses.
I mean, massive casualties on both sides.
150,000 is a number that I've seen thrown around for Russian casualties in this war. Absolutely unreal.
I mean, that's like a small city, really, if you think about it.
And so the fact that now a peace deal question mark is being thrown around makes me want to throw up.
Is
It really
focused
does,
on
because
Israel.
there were, you have no idea how much boiling bullshit I've had thrown in my face from the beginning of this conflict going, peace deal? You know what I mean? I've literally been called a traitor. I've been called a fucking asset. I've been called all this.
Okay, I'm just gonna. Saying peace deal, I don't feel like contributes anything at all. Because if you've been following this war or looking into any of the history behind this war for any period of time, and you realize how many peace deal solutions have been thrown at the wall and failed, or have been rejected outright as non-starters. What is it? Over 200 rounds of negotiation. Over 12 peace deal ceasefires. All of which have failed. All of which have failed. Now, when you're going into this war in 2022 with that history, with that backdrop, and then the war happens again, the Russians invade on a large scale after saying they wouldn't, once again, just like in 2014, lying the whole way. They cross the border, and then the proposals you're seeing are demilitarization of Ukraine, meaning Ukraine putting down all their guns so that Russia can invade them next time and they'll be more successful, so that they can do what they did on Bucha on a larger scale. That's how the Ukrainians are going to view it, and I don't think they're silly for viewing it that way. When you looked at the things that Russia was demanding, they were non-starters. They were non-starters. It wasn't like, okay, how about Crimea is an autonomous, independent state, separate of both of us, and we have a secular democracy, and, you know, they can be both Russian and Ukraine. There was no, like reasonable. It was, we're going to take all this land, you're going to demilitarize, like Zelensky's going to step down. The demands were, of course, rejected by the Ukrainians. And I think rightfully so rejected by the Ukrainians, because the demands would just see their state being unable to resist any Russian influence and any Russian power into the future. And they'd lose any ability to use NATO or even the possibility of NATO membership as a negotiating tool with the Russians, saying, you have to treat me fairly because there's another power in the room. But when they promise off NATO membership and give away their army, what leverage do they have to defend themselves with? So at what point was there a peace deal during those early days that Paul Ziga was talking about that would have been like, yes, that's the reasonable peace deal that would be offered, that both the Russians would accept and the Ukrainians would accept, and not some, you know, imperial like border drawer in DC would accept, as we imagine the cutting up of Africa, right? So what deal? Because I haven't seen any that they would accept. I haven't. So when you just say peace deal in a situation where neither side is willing to compromise on key issues, and I think the Ukrainian side, and from my conversations with them, they would agree, is much more in their right to defend themselves. And the Russian demands are non-starters. What else are you what are you expecting? What do you get by saying peace deal? What peace deal is there to be negotiated? If the Russian position changes or the Ukrainian position changes, then there's, something to talk about. If the leverage becomes so heavy on one side that there's no other choice but to, have to give one side has to give up, then okay. But during these early days, none of those conditions existed. So just saying peace deal after 200 rounds of failed negotiation and 12 failed ceasefires doesn't solve anything. It doesn't fix anything. It's just calling for the same old that has already failed in the past with no guideline on how. What would Paul Zigo offer the Russians to get their dedication to peace? That wouldn't end up just killing the Ukrainians more slowly down the road. What would be his offer? Because if you call for peace deal, I don't just want a bland call for peace deal. Then it's no different than the last 200 failed rounds of negotiation. There has to be some guidelines. What are we going to do? What's special about this deal that's going to make it succeed? Or just going into this process that is probably already doomed to fail completely blind.
Prior to an entire generation of Ukrainian and Russian young people being forced to kill each other in the most horrible meat grinder of this century.
Paul is not the first person to think of the idea of peace between Russia and Ukraine. Many people have, and many people attempted it. There were negotiations between the Ukrainians and the Russians up until the Russian invasion, and there were negotiations afterwards, all of which failed, just like all the other rounds of negotiations, because the Russian position was a non-starter, that the Ukrainians know would permanently cripple them, and the Ukrainians were not willing to concede to what Putin, number one, wanted ideologically, wanted strategically, and needed to in order to justify, the loss of Russian lives to the people, to the Russian public.
But Moloch needed his sacrifices, Paul. So, I get what you're saying, but until that number was reached, they couldn't have any peace. I think they're about.
He's basically, the way Paul's ego is throwing it out here just makes it sound like all those people died for nothing because they all could have just gotten a semicircle, smoked some hookah, and then negotiated a peace deal and all got together and said kumbaya. And if it's that easy, if it was that simple, if the solution is just right there, so obviously dangling in front of his face that he's been able to see it since day one, then I would love to hear it.
To reach the number, so I think Moloch, and Mammoth and all those guys, I think they might be a little happy. So all right, you killed enough. You guys killed enough.
So I'm just sick of this shit, man. I'm sick of people having to why does every lesson have to be learned the hard way? Why does 300,000 young people?
Well, what was the lesson this time? We should have just given the Russians everything they wanted and disarmed Ukraine. Was that the lesson? There was a Putin-Biden summit 5 months before the Russians invaded, where we tried to talk to them, and at that summit, Ukraine didn't even really come up. Ukraine didn't really even come up. But we do know in December of 2021, the Russians were gathering ships and grain storage equipment for stealing Ukrainian grain after they invaded. That Putin had an idea months in advance of exactly what he was going to do. Oh, the evidence seems to point in that direction. So once that's happening, and the Russian demands are non-starters, like dropping NATO protections for Baltic states, other nation states that Vladimir Putin said in his speech are artificial, and that he would use that speech and use that foundation to ideologically justify the invasions of, withdrawing NATO protections from them, withdrawing the nuclear umbrella from them. Dangerous proposals with no concessions on the other end. If he was making those proposals while also proposing to pull out of the Donbass or pull out of Crimea and give that territory back, there's yeah, this seems like a general de-escalation of tensions that we can get behind. But that wasn't it. He was playing hardball, just trying to get us to blink and make it easier for him to do the same thing in other countries. And once we said, no, we're not going to do that, he just continued with his already existing plan to invade the country. Well, so I want to hear the peace plan. I just want to hear the peace plan. Because if people say we need a plan to do something, we need a plan to avoid this whole big war, we need a plan to avoid cleaning up this mess and actually winning this war. What's the plan to avoid doing this? Because it would just be too costly. And you say that we need to do that plan, but you don't have a plan. At a certain point, it just sounds like, you know, it sounds like a con.
Will have to be ground into pulsating pulp paste before people start going, you know what? Maybe it's time to broker some sort of land deal over there. Get, you know, give them a sliver of what they want and get some peace over there.
What does that mean? What does that mean? Give them a sliver of what they want. What the Russians want? Okay, what about what the Ukrainians want? And what does a sliver mean? Does that mean they get to control what? Because the Russians are attacking Avdiivka right now. So does that mean not only do they get to keep Crimea, what they have right now in Kherson and Zaporozhye, but we have the Ukrainians in cities like Kramatorsk evacuate, so we give them the rest of the Donbass? What does this mean? Does it mean we just allow them to hold on to what they have now? Freeze the contact line? What does give them a sliver of what they want? I don't know what that means. I want to hear that outlined.
Why does it take you so long to come to that? And when I told you that this war was going to grind on and on and on, a lot of you laughed in my face. Russia can't even fucking keep it up in the next 3 months, bro. I heard all this and all those people, crickets chirping now. Where are you at? Where are these motherfuckers at when reality turns out to support my view? You've just disappeared and now you're on to some other thing. You don't even remember when you were war simping for this. So go yourself to everybody who's now going like, you know what, maybe peace deal. A little late to morality, you mother.
No one's going to show a bit. I mean, Paul, you know the reality. No one's going to show up and be like, Paul, I think you were right. Dude, even if they know that, even if they feel that in their bones.
I mean, it just feels like what Paul's solution to every war would be immediately once it started to just start yelling at the top of his lungs, peace deal, peace deal, peace deal, peace deal. Which, I mean, if neither side is willing to negotiate and one side is dead set on brutalizing another country, and that country, for obvious reasons, is dead set on not being brutalized, like, at a certain point, you have to accept the reality of the situation, and you can hold out for peace, but if you just base your entire strategy on peace, on the vague hope that, you know, that the other side will compromise, and that compromise will be something you're willing to swallow, because it could be something very horrific, you can't always bet on that.
Dude, they're just going to slink away and go like... No.
So, I mean, some wars are worth winning.
I always thought that.
Russia and Ukraine are not really center stage anymore. And apparently now there are leaks and whispers that maybe...
that's an old war.
...changed its posture.
Boring.
We're on to our next war now.
I mean, that's how it is now in the world. It's all like, look, that war was last year. People are dying. Tragic. My heart goes out to them. But what about what's going on in Israel and Palestine?
Ukraine and Russia, like, hey, let's work something out here. Like, let's wrap it up. This is really interesting. So this is in NBC News.
Let's wrap it up, guys. That's a wrap.
We've cashed in on this one. And look, there's a whole new opportunity going on in the West Bank. So maybe we need to get this one off the book so we can really focus on this new one, you know?
Well, U.S. Congress is way more likely to approve money for Israel at this point than they are Ukraine, so makes sense.
Topic of peace negotiations with Ukraine, sources say. The conversations have included very broad outlines for what Ukraine might need to give up.
I mean, I don't know what to say about the money stuff. I always respond the same thing. Since man has beaten other man with sharpened rock, man has sold sharpened rock for profit. This is true about all weapons and all companies that have profited from weapons. And different forms of lobbying, as we see existing in the United States, even though it's been perfected in the United States, have existed to some extent in the past. There will be people who profit off of the suffering of others. That is true. But I don't think the Soviets would have denied any American manufactured trucks because some capitalist made money while manufacturing those trucks to be sent to the Soviets to fight the Nazis. I mean, there have been wars that were moral to fight. All of them, people have profited from them. I mean, you can try to remove the coercive influence of the defense industry's money in politics. I think that is fine, but just kind of like vaguely going to like, oh, we've profited off this war and now we can just kick it off. Like that's all this war was. Like that's all the Ukrainians were fighting for. Like that's all the usefulness of their struggle is. Or that's all it was to the United States, which I would say is unbelievably reductive of American defense policy. And the interests of the different Congress people who get this legislation through. Or the people who are writing the legislation to get aid through.
Okay. Now, it's a little more complex than that here. We'll dive into it, and you guys can make your own mind up on it here. They say U.S. and European officials have begun quietly talking to the Ukrainian government about what possible peace negotiations with Russia might entail to end the war,
Hayes
according to one current senior U.S.
Vietnam negotiated peace with France. France negotiated peace taking territory after territory. After peace negotiation, Vietnam...
Man, that was a long post. That was a long post Lucy made. At the peace negotiation, Vietnam was a French colony in its entirety. Make of that what you will. Look, I wish I don't wish we held this standard for other people. I wish we didn't hold the standard for Ukraine, but when we look back on the Algerian fight against French colonialism, nobody post after the fact is saying, oh yeah, they should have negotiated more. You know, nobody's saying that same thing when it comes to the fight against Rhodesia or any of those anti-colonial struggles, at least in left-wing communities. Yet when it comes to Ukraine and their fight against Russian colonialism, we seem to be unable to amount 1/1,000,000th what we were willing to amount for the struggle against terror during the War on Terror. Even though it's increasing, it's increasing Ukraine's ability to fight back against colonialism. It's increasing Europe's ability to stand up against Russian encroachment on their internationally defined borders, and it's protecting a continent that every time it develops into a major war, we 100% get involved in. It's just very strange.
Official and one former senior U.S. official familiar with the discussions. The conversations have included broad outlines of what Ukraine might need to give up to reach a deal. The official said,
I mean, like, I just don't, like, in my mind, if you don't support the defense of Ukraine, I don't see you ever saying that America's military power should ever do anything in the world. It really does feel that way if you're coming from the left-wing perspective on this. Because if that's your position, then at least, okay, I got you. Your position is abolish America. I feel like it's very naive. Okay, I don't think that'll work. I think we've seen what creating gigantic power vacuums where bad actors could take advantage has created in the past. Putting all of that aside, if Russia wins the war in Ukraine and Ukraine loses, what will that ultimately mean for the Ukrainian people? It'll mean a crushed civil society. It will mean the deportation of millions of people out of Ukraine and the forced fleeing of millions of people who are going to fear government suppression. We're going to see the end of any sort of democracy, freedom of expression, freedom of religion is going to be cracked down upon, which people talk about the Russian Orthodox Church and how it's being treated in Ukraine. Not a lot of people talk about how Protestants were treated in occupied Donetsk or what the militias did to religious minority groups in occupied Donbass. There's going to be more corruption in Ukrainian politics. We're going to regress on any development the police have made in purging out the special forces corruption and trying to pull back the amount of police abuse that they were engaging in. We're going to see a reduction in press freedoms. We're going to see a ton of Western companies pulling out of the country. We're going to see a lack of integration with the European economy, and therefore a subjugation to the Russian economy. There's so much negative. We're not even talking about the executions or the torture chambers or anything like that. There's just so much negative that it's so hard for me to think talking to a left winger, when we know these weapons are going to go somewhere, we know these artillery guns are going to go somewhere, and we could be sending them to Ukraine to support their fight against colonialism. And when we're going to start saying, nah, let's not do that. And what's going to happen? All those shells are going to be voted on and sent to Israel. And then they're going to ram into Gaza. And then what have you accomplished? What have you accomplished? In practical terms, what have you accomplished? Anyway, continuing.
Some of the talks, which officials describe as delicate, took place last month during a meeting of representatives from more than 50 nations supporting Ukraine. So to be fair, they say this happened last month. I don't know. I guess that I'm not sure how the timeline works out there in terms of did this happen after October 7th? I'm not sure. Took place last month during a meeting of representatives.
So I saw somebody in gutter chat say this hyperbolic. 50% of the Donbass's population left due to the occupation in Donetsk and Luhansk. 50%. That's pre-2022 invasion. They left in droves due to political persecution, due to the worsening economic state, due to the mafia-style politics, because in the Donbass, criminals layer their political system from top to bottom. Those people all left because they saw how the future of their lives would be if they were contained to that area. If they were contained to that type of mafia-style politics, lack of civil representation, lack of democratic rule, and lack of any national identity, or it has been denied of them, removed from them. All those people fled because they didn't want to deal with those conditions. And so somebody's telling me that if Russia was able to take over 20 to 25 to 30% of the country, that more people wouldn't flee and that they wouldn't engage in the same behavior they did there. Torture, death pits, executions, false imprisonment, holding people without bail, without a trial, forced conscription in occupied territory, which is against international law. Like they're going to engage in all the same behavior they've already engaged in. They're just going to do it on a larger scale. It's not hyperbolic if they've already done it.
From more than 50 nations supporting Ukraine, including NATO members known as the Ukraine Defense Contact Group, the official said. The discussions are an acknowledgement of the dynamics militarily on the ground in Ukraine and politically in the U.S. and Europe, officials said. They began amid concerns among U.S. and European officials that the war has reached a stalemate and about the ability to continue providing aid to Ukraine. Biden administration officials also are worried that Ukraine is running out of forces while Russia has a seemingly endless supply. Ukraine.
What? But wait a minute. That's not what I was heard. That's what I heard. What?
But the Russians, I mean, they've burnt through a very significant portion of their tank stockpile in a year and a half. I think like 30 to like 35% of it already. And so I don't see how they keep that up for another 9 years. They don't have the production capacity. They don't have the foreign exports. So I just don't think it's like financially even feasible.
I can't believe it. Wow.
I'm just gonna assume TJ, like, it didn't. Man, how do I assume the best here? I'm gonna assume the best here and think that TJ just made an honest mistake. I am assuming that this was clipped in order to show that I said something, like I had informed him something wrong. That was what he was trying to show by talking about the armor shipments. But everything I said was true. Russia having more people doesn't disprove what I said. Russia could start to engage in meat assaults, but the conversation we were having, you can hear it at the end of that, said it was about 9 years of war. I don't think this war is going to last 9 years. I don't think it's possible. And that's what I was trying to explain, that I do not think that the Russians and Ukrainians have enough just physical equipment to continue the war as they've been fighting it right now, at the intensity that they're fighting it, for 9 years. I just don't think it's possible. The Russians don't have that much Soviet reserves, and the Ukrainians certainly aren't getting that much Western equipment. And so when he proposed, or it was either him or Paul proposed, that this war is going to go on for, well, what if this war goes on for 9 years? That was what I was responding to. I was saying the Russians have already expelled 30 to 35% of their tank stockpiles. They have lost a lot of tanks, a lot of armor. That's true. That if they were to continue that intensity of loss for 9 years, they would run out. Same thing's true for the Ukrainians. I wasn't commenting on the amount of soldiers both sides has. The Russians obviously have more soldiers. But I was just commenting on the intensity of the fighting for 9 years. So I don't really think that's a good clip usage.
So simple math.
Also, part of the reason why I want to send aid is so we can preserve as many Ukrainian lives in this process as possible and get them the best armor that can protect the people who need it. Hey, Nico Suris, thank you so much for the raid of 74. I appreciate it. VTuber raid. I don't get those often. VTuber raid, VTuber raid. Welcome, VTubers. Hope you're doing some good VTubing on the weekends.
Math didn't fail me. Amazing. No,
the ghost.
It's very fun for them. It's very funny. It's very funny.
No.
Yeah.
Oh my God.
I mean, look, it's simple math, man. Like, you can have all the men in the world if you don't have the armor and tanks and people to put them and like the equipment to use. Like, it's tough shit, man.
The hell did you hear, TJ? I heard what was said. Open your ears.
Hello, this is AI TJ.
Okay, I don't need to hear their AI ad.
I cannot.
I mean, I guess maybe people feel our
I
case
want to go
was so
rewatch
bad.
our entire Dylan Burns episode now.
And just like all of the fucking dude, just the bullshit. I bought the party line misinformation.
Oh,
and
dude,
you're a
retard.
retard. You're a retard for going. Oh yeah, dude.
And that's the shit about for people like Dylan Burns. I watched some of that episode, didn't watch all of it, but like I will just say this, that like honestly I empathize with him because of the fact that they will have people go out and sell that shit so hardcore, and then they will f them in the ass immediately when it's like, okay, we're just gonna cut a deal now.
Yeah, they'll throw you completely overboard.
What is that even for? Who is he talking to? Is he talking about me? Who's gonna fuck me over there? I'm not funded by the fucking CIA. I'm not funded by the Pinkerton company. I'm an independent journalist. I'm self-funded. I might be funded by the odd, mobile game, some stream sponsorship. But nobody's gonna screw me. I decided to go to Ukraine and document this war that many people there compare to their independence struggle, their 1776, their struggle for liberation, as many people have fought for their liberation before. I want to document it because I think documenting it is important, not only to inform people about it, but these first drafts of history that are being made when you document this are important for a good historical foundation and to help people understand what exactly happened there so people can't lie about it afterwards. Pretend to say it wasn't as brutal as it was, to pretend to say that it wasn't as murderous as it was. So no matter what happens, I feel that I've done an effort to do that, and I am doing my best to do that. And so no matter how the American government's position changes, I still want to document the war. Anyway.
So they basically have what this is about is they've basically used your support in order to continue a pointless, bloody war.
It's time for the goalpost to move.
What I really don't like from Paul, and I think it was funny when I was growing up and watching this, because it was funny to see him be kind of like a smug, prick to one guy, another guy. But then it was damn, now he's being the smug prick to the issue that I care about. It's oh, that's actually quite annoying. Definitely when the person talking doesn't really know what they're saying. Oh my God. It wasn't pointless at any point for the Ukrainians to shoot back at the occupier that was dumping their people at death pits. And I call them death pits now because if you saw Izium, or if you saw what is now laying at Bucha, oh, sorry, my chair's busted. They're not really graves. I guess Bucha more, maybe more so. At least it's in a cemetery. You know, they just took the bodies and put them in one big hole. It was a death pit. Many of the hands still had their, you know, hands were tied behind their back when they were executed. They were death pits. You know, and you see your country sprouting death pits across the country, all across occupied territory. Having those last conversations as people are brought under occupation, and waves of refugees flee with horror stories. And then you, as the president of the invading country, calls your nation artificial. Oh, you're all basically our people anyway. We're going in. It's our historic right. To fire back at that and to fight against that. As he goes in and he signs executive orders to seize anyone's property at whim. That type of just basic violation of people's rights. There is no civil society within Russian occupied territory. There isn't really even a civil society within Russia, but there's far less one in occupied territory. And to say to fight against that was pointless. To stop the Russians from taking over Kiev was pointless after we saw their death lists in action, or them fighting back in Kharkiv, stopping them from taking that city, or the fight to liberate Kherson, a city of 600,000 people liberated. 150,000 lives is a lot of people, as Paul noted. 600,000 is also a lot of people to abandon. It was not for nothing. For fucking pointless war. Pointless for who? If the Ukrainians didn't fought it, the Ukrainians wouldn't exist. If the Ukrainians didn't fight it, they wouldn't exist. It's not like Putin is that you know, opposed to calling their state artificial or seizing their territory.
You guys literally don't grasp at all what we're disagreeing with you about. You act like being invaded is somehow a choice of the person.
I've never said that. I've never said being invaded was a choice, and that you just that
move
was
that goalpost on down.
So then what deal? Because if they could have proposed a deal to stop the war, then there is at least some choices that could have been made differently. What deal?
I wouldn't even say that.
Chad is always really dumb on this topic.
Well, yeah, you're saying that now, but a year ago we were the dumb ones, and everybody in chat agreed with that. See, it's just bullshit. You know what, dude? If you at least had a little a pair of balls in your sack to be able to go like, dude, I was wrong. I got propaganda.
If we would have made that peace deal like in what? Like, let's say March, April, May, like June of 2022, that would have meant Kharkiv like slightly surrounded and Kherson still occupied. What would we say to all those people? They're just like an externality. Like, what was the point to make the deal, and what was the deal?
Propagandized into that. You're right. I should have been calling for peace from the very jump, because they're
just calling for peace to what? Like, bland, blind calls for peace achieve nothing. No more than bland, blind calls for negotiations change anything. It's less productive than the UN yapping what Paul's ego is proposing.
There'd be, 500,000 people not lying dead in a bloody ditch somewhere in eastern Ukraine, and
they probably would. They probably still, everything would have gone the same. I don't know what magic deal he has up his ass. Just like Trump says he has up his ass. He's going to sit down first day, pull out this peace deal, in 24 hours, all going to be over. Paul's not making that claim, but if you're saying that there was a peace deal possible, I'd just like to see it, because I don't see it. And I've been looking at it desperately. I've been looking for it desperately because I don't want my friends to keep fucking dying. I don't like getting bombed that much. And I'd love more than anyone else in the world to see a peace deal. So what one is possible, and what is one that will make sure that another war doesn't happen down the road, and one that will be acceptable for the Ukrainian people so they can achieve some level of prosperity and not be turned into some rump state.
Like that would be at least, I could at least stand that. But it's this just like slow adoption of my opinion that happens. and then this kind of like act like they always had that opinion once it finally arrives to the reality of the situation. Like, oh yeah, man, it's like Joe Biden.
Well, Blumby, I thought you were a Jenga fan.
Danny, no. Danny, no. That's not true. Because we literally have said that the U.S. should have intervened and pressured both sides towards peace. And now that's what's happened. We were told that's impossible. That can't happen. And now it literally is.
What does that mean? Pressure both sides towards peace. What was the peace that Russia would have accepted? How would we intervene to do that? Number one, how do we intervene to pressure both sides? And what do we pressure the Ukrainians to accept? And what do we pressure the Russians to accept? Do we just pressure the Ukrainians to accept the Russian peace deal? Because how are we going to pressure the Russians? Is it going to be by sending aid? Is it going to be by putting our troops on the ground and risking an incident between two nuclear-armed states? Would you be willing to send all the aid necessary that early on in the war when we haven't seen how the Ukrainians are going to perform in February and March yet? What pressuring would have to happen, and what indication do we have that the Russians would have accepted whatever deal that you're proposing, if it's even a good deal?
Yeah, I mean, there should have been way more measures to prevent that war from ever happening.
Like, what would you say to somebody in Kramatorsk who, under whatever deal the Russians propose, they would almost certainly demand all of the Donbass? And the people who are living in Kramatorsk right now in free, unoccupied parts of the Donbass who would, under this peace deal, be forcibly moved from their homes.
Sooner, and like hundreds of thousands of people that are dead didn't have to be dead.
But by what peace deal pressured? And by the way, he's saying, oh, they could have just done this earlier in the war. Number one, all we know is that there are people in the United States government who want to see some pressure for a deal. That's all we know. That's really all we know. How do we go from that to this is the American government pressuring Zelensky to make a deal right now? And number one, it's going to work. And number two, it's going to be a good outcome.
Yep.
Zelensky's government doesn't even acknowledge that there was any pressure being applied to them for this. So how do we know that this is working? What happens when, like, a year from now, the war is still going on and all these murmurs turn into nothing? What happens if that is how this all rolls about, how this all turns out?
A bunch of buildings that are
obviously when Ukraine gets attacked and there's tanks and jets and fucking bombs going out,
Scotty's
obviously
gotta reel them in
to defend themselves at that point. But we're saying like they never should have gotten to that fucking to begin
Okay, then how do you avoid it getting to that point? What do you offer them?
with?
And America had its finger on the pulse of that conflict from the jump and could have brought both sides.
What did he say?
America had its finger on the pulse of that conflict from the jump and could have brought both sides to the table and brokered a deal.
Fucking, oh God, man. I feel the ignorance like slipping off and like hitting the ground. I can hear it. I can hear it with every fiber of my being. What deal could have been negotiated? What could we have told the Ukrainians? You got to do this. You got to give up the Donbass. You got to promise that Crimea is gone forever. You got to demilitarize, bro. Give up all your guns. It's a brilliant idea. Trust Putin, man. He's a trustworthy guy, man. Ignore the last 200 rounds of failed negotiation. Ignore the 12 violated ceasefires after every ceasefire you agreed to. Ignore the fact that the Russians still have yet to acknowledge Russian troops in occupied Ukraine, as they intervene in every single battle between rebels and the government on the side of the rebels to help them win. I just want to hear Paul Zigo lay it down.
Would have led to over like 500,000 people still being alive.
Look, if we had elected Donald Trump, I had to say this, guy. I saw an interview with him. He said, "Look, he just told Putin, don't even think about it." That's all I had to say. Don't even think about it. So Joe Biden is.
By the way, it's weird to hear Scotty mock how stupid that Trump thing is. Don't even think about it. Just don't do it. But their thing is just as stupid, which is I don't know if this is Scotty's prescription, at least TJ's and Paul's, is just negotiate the thing that's already failed a million other times and with no details on how negotiations would go. Their position as of right now is not really substantially different in any way than Trump's position, which is, oh, I'd negotiate a deal. I have the best deal. Everybody laughs at them when he says that. Ha ha ha. He said he has the best deal, but he hasn't even said what the deal is. Ha ha ha. But then Polzico and TJ Kirk say it, and their chats are like, true, based. We're not dumb like how Trump said it. We said it the based and true way.
Think about it, Jack.
Don't even think about it, TJ. Don't even think. Oh, Putin was like,
up, bitch.
I'm not going to do it, even though they had already made invasions into Ukraine at that point. But whatever. Well, that's neither here nor there.
I'm just tired of it, dude. And dude, not to bring it back to what we were just talking about, but this whole Biden situation, who called that before Biden was even elected? That was me. Who said, what the worst case scenario I see here is we get a Biden presidency that's basically just a pause of all Trump era policy. And he's so weak and so feckless and so demented that Trump comes back and beats him again in 2024. And everybody was like, whatever, idiot. Are you a Trump simp? Is that what's going on here? Are you a secret Trumper or something? That's retarded, dude. Trump done. It's Jover, bro. And now here we are. We've arrived. And that's exactly what happened. Trumper.
Man, he knocked the fuck out of those tomato cans.
About some of President Zelensky's open-ended conscription requirements. So that's really interesting. I did not know that. I know that Russia has like pulled up, they've done conscription, they pull people up, and
All right.
Yeah, manpower is the main concern right now. That Ukraine's running out of people to throw in front of the wood chipper. That is endless Russian aggression. Oops. Whole generation of fatherless and motherless children in Ukraine for something that could have been stopped before it even started if our leaders cared enough about human life and human dignity to.
God, this is just hippie nonsense. All of this is just fucking hippie nonsense. If all of our leaders would just dropped more acid and smoked more pot and all got in a circle and fucking hit the drum, they'd all come together and realize war is bad and we'll just compromise. And, you know, Ukraine will give Russia more sunflowers and Russia will give Ukraine more oil. And you know, we've got a deal.
Do something about it. But you know what they cared about more?
Money.
I
didn't wait. I pre-watched like the first 2 minutes. Okay, I didn't pre-watch this. I didn't. That's funny.
Making Raytheon money, making Boeing money. Well, go yourselves, all of you.
I mean, yeah, even taking that part of like, you know, what should have happened to begin with out of it, like taking that, if we're just saying about there is a war, I mean, like how do people, I mean, is there any denying that those companies are benefiting immensely from it?
I mean, and the surprised Pikachu face is real cute from the left now that Biden's just like totally and completely useless on this fucking Israeli genocide going on. They're just like, why hasn't Biden stepped in and done something? It's like, you were told, idiot.
It's only been a month. I genuinely think something's going to happen soon.
It's only been a month of the most brutal bombing campaign in modern history. This motherfucker told you who he was. He's got a long political career, and never once has he spoken an ill word about Israel.
Okay, by the way, on the manpower concerns, let me just talk about this quickly, because I do know, I do know a lot of Ukrainian conscription officers. Okay, let me say not a lot. I know one very well, and I know a few else, like as acquaintance, but I know one very well. And I talked to him about conscription because, you know, conscription in Ukraine is a really big issue. It's very old style, very Soviet still. I talked to him like a year ago, maybe a year and 6 months ago, about conscription, and he said 1.5% of it is digitized. The rest of it's all on paper, all old lists and stuff. He's like, oh God, that's terrible. He's like, yeah. A year later, I asked him the same question, 2.5% is digitized. So to say that the Ukrainian conscription system is old-fashioned is underplaying it. And when I talk to conscription officers, they talk constantly, and there's something you hear a lot from Ukrainians working in the bureaucracy: the Soviet mentality. This is the way it's always been done, so this is the way we do it. And so when the rubber hits the road and regulations from 40-50 years ago don't work anymore, whether it be for combat operations or otherwise, it takes a lot of trial and error before eventually somebody changes it. Not a lot of adaptability. Sorry, I'm losing the English language. Matt Binder, thank you so much for the raid. I appreciate the raid of 43. Thank you, thank you, thank you. I appreciate it. I love Matt Binder. I appreciate Matt Binder calling out the Bollywood stuff. And I appreciate Matt Binder not being a brainlet on Ukraine, which is, you know, a high honor for me. I gave him my Medal of Honor, okay? Non-brainlet is a Medal of Honor. Tokyo Hans, thank you so much for the tier 1 sub. I appreciate it. Yeah, anyway, where was I? Where was I? I completely lost my train of thought. Medals all around. Anyway, this was a bad debate. This was a bad... Well, it wasn't a debate. I mean, this bad news review. I was, yeah, no, man. I think if you just throw out peace deal blindly, you're just saying that, you know, I wish the crisis wasn't here. I wish the war wasn't here. And I mean, like, that's great. But the Ukrainians didn't get a choice in that. And if they've given the option of national elimination, national eradication, the destruction of their nation state, and then the destruction of their national identity
occurred,
and or you know,
_1 got a tier
accepting that with peace or war, they choose the war.
Work, Dylan and crew.
This one, thanks so much for the tier 3. I appreciate it. Anyway, I'd like to talk to these guys about this all again. I told them in the comments. I know they saw it, and I told them in DMs. So I'm available if they want to talk about any of the disagreements that I have with them. But yeah, I got a lot of disagreements with them. This was not a great thing. You got to understand, after 200 failed rounds of negotiations with the Russians and 12 negotiated ceasefires, at a certain point, hearing somebody say, negotiate another ceasefire is not a satisfactory answer. There has to be real structural change in some defense mechanism to make sure that when the cannon stop firing and the West moves its attention elsewhere, that the Russians don't just stay laser focused, build up for 5 years, invade again, and we're going to be too fatigued from the last war or too driven towards, for example, some confrontation in Taiwan or somewhere else that drag us away from supporting Ukraine, especially if it isn't brought under the NATO umbrella. And these are answers that I haven't gotten satisfactory responses to. And for me, it doesn't seem like the pro-peace or the pro-long-term stability or pro-freedom position to accept a state of affairs that could just lead up into another war 5 years from now, which is what we did in 2015 and 2016 after the Ukrainians launched the ATO. And it failed after the Russians pushed their troops across the border, lying about it the whole time. 200 rounds of negotiation, 12 ceasefires. Will number 13 work? 201 work? Yeah, we'll see. By the way, that 200 number does not include rounds of negotiation since the start of the 2022 war.